Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about themes with borrowed chords. And I don't think I've actually ever covered this one in a video, but it's actually in a piece of my personal music, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. What we're going to do is go over it, then I'm going to give you some tips on how to use borrowed chords and what notes to actually choose, and some exercises actually. I found one of the hardest things with students is that they have a hard time choosing melodic note selection, so we'll go over parts of that. Here's the sequence. Okay, we're going to only cover to that point. The rest starts to transition around very highly chromatically, so we're not going to even bother doing that. So we want to cover where just the main theme is actually being presented very strongly around a C tonal center. Now when it comes to note choices, sometimes you actually do form scales like Mixolydian flat 6, like that. And this is where note selection comes in, because it does not use that all the time, right here. So when you're doing a lot of borrowing, you're going to temporarily form all these different scales. However, you're not confined to that scale. I wrote out the basic version of the harmony. It's just a 1, C major, and a 2 half diminished. And I'm calling it half diminished instead of a pedal point because the upper parts and the winds are doing that half diminished shape. Now here's the chord sequence, just 1, 2, half diminished, 1, 5, minor 7th, 1, 2, half diminished, 5, minor 7th, flat 3, borrowed, minor 5, 4, flat 6, flat 3, flat 6, minor 7th, 5, 1. When I talk about note choice here, there was a reason I'm using the flat 6 and the flat 7 on the minor 5 chord. Let me play it in a way that's actually more pianistic. That flat 6 is begging to resolve downward towards your tonic, even though you're no longer using a dominant chord as your 5 chord. Now here's what's cool about borrowing. You could harmonize other tones besides the 5 chord now, the flat 3, which goes back to the minor 5 to bring the theme to a closeout, but we use a chromatic sequence or real sequence, they're called. Then back to our minor 5, minor 7th chord, flat 6 to resolve. Then it starts to use the main theme to start transitioning away. But we won't go into this aspect. I'm trying to figure out how to play it pianistically. Okay. Anyway, we'll skip that part. So again, note choices. You temporarily may form a Mixolydian flat 6 scale or a harmonic major scale, etc. But I'm not calling this either one of those because we have both the flat 6 and the raised 6 within the melodic material here. So a lot of different chromatic scale degrees are used. The hardest part about borrowing, I think, is trying to find your way home after moving around with borrowed chords. You have to have some kind of scheme that's going to get you back logically. That's one of the hardest parts, where the transition back to 1 sounds inevitable. That's a little harder to do and it's tricky. So here's one exercise you could do. Take any diatonic melody, let's say all white keys in this case. So going from the C to a G, I could use the E flat borrowed chord. You could use the regular 4 back to 1. In other words, harmonizing diatonic scale tones. This is an extremely good exercise because you could take Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and use all borrowed chords, or a lot of different borrowed chords, and it'll totally change the way you feel about this little melody. If I go, well, look at it. That's part of the E flat. Okay, F major, normal, okay, F minor, C, G minor or B flat, or G minor 7th, whatever you want to do. So literally look at your scale tones and ask yourself what parallel minor borrowed chord fits that. And it totally changes your perception about nursery rhyme to less nursery rhyme sounding. Here's another thing I could do to reharmonize it. Make it sound jazzy. So get into the habit of reharmonizing diatonic melodies, but in this case with borrowed chords only, or diatonic chords mixed with borrowed chords in this case. You'll notice both versions totally change your perception of that same melody. And when you're done with that, start messing around with altered tones that are temporarily going to appear like other scales. And then you have to start making little decisions. What tones do I use with which specific borrowed chord? That's totally up to you. That's almost completely subjective at that point. And note choices like this, going to that flat 6 on a minor 7th chord, is actually an alternative to using a dominant chord. A dominant flat 9 chord would also work, but in this case I chose not to do that. You could still say minor 7th flat 9, but I call it flat 6 degree. So here's the sequence again, enjoy.